Good evening, ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties. This is Alex coming at you from the underworld, and welcome back to another episode of. In this episode, I'm reviewing another title from the extensive TBR that I created for myself a couple of months ago. And once again, this is a disturbing book that is full of trigger warnings from beginning to end. Which, of course, I'm speaking about the infamous novella called Dead Inside by Chandler Morrison. Now, before I get started, I would just like to note that even though this book does fit into the category of transgressive fiction, it is primarily an extreme book. And until I read this, I had never encountered anything so vile and disgusting in all of my existence. So, if you are easily offended or if you have a weak stomach, you're probably going to want to skip the spoiler segment of this video, as I will be discussing in detail subjects like cannibalism, necrophilia, and graphic infant death. Otherwise, for the remainder of the video, I'll try to be as delicate about these subjects as possible. Also, prior to starting Dead Inside, I should have seen a red flag when my good friend Oliver hit me up and said that he noticed that I had this book in my TBR, and he was excited to see my reaction after reading it. Instead, my naive little self was like, okay, will do, and I gathered up a group of friends for a buddy read, which among those I included my good online friends Nisa and Hanny, and for a change, luckily, Nisa and I were able to start our read before Hanny could. And about midway through, we messaged Hanny and was like, do not proceed. Warning, danger. You will not be able to unread this. Once again, do not proceed. So, to give you a good idea of how disturbing this book is, this is actually the first time in my existence that I cautioned a friend to not proceed forward with a work of fiction, because for the most part, I'm the type of asshole who loves to see the look of shock on a loved one's face. However, I just couldn't do that to Hanny. So even though Hanny tapped out before this book went straight to hell, Nisa and I continued forward, and by the time we finished, we had no other choice but to laugh as a means of defense against what we had just encountered. Then, after we were able to regain our senses, Nisa and I both agreed that if we were going to go to the bottom of the iceberg in regards to disturbing literature, we were glad that we went there together, because had this been a solitary read, I'm not necessarily certain how I would have processed everything without having someone else to talk to as we made this journey together. With that said, I will admit that I had to read this book twice in a row because after I read it the first time, I was so shocked by one scene in particular, I could not compose my thoughts or focus on anything else after that. And I'm really glad that I read this a second time because after doing so, I saw this work was so much more than just a shock factor, as it presented quite a few philosophies and philosophical questions. Anywho, before I get too far ahead of myself, I would just like to thank Nisa for buddy reading this with me, and I really do appreciate Hanny giving this her best go. Also, Oliver, I hope you enjoyed the reaction because this is totally it. And if any of you are watching this review, I hope you enjoy it. But without me rambling on any further, let's go visit the Preston Druce Charity Hospital and see what's bumping in the morgue. Dead Inside by Chandler Morrison introduces a narrator who speaks directly to the reader about his life and desires. Early on, he presents himself as a young man who works the night shift security for the Preston Druce Charity Hospital. And since he has no desires to connect with other humans, this occupation suits him well as it allows him to be antisocial and it gives him the opportunity to read and study for his college courses. Aside from having the ability to enjoy peace and quiet, This also gives him the opportunity to sneak off to the morgue, where he defiles the remains of the recently deceased. At this point, it's established that he practices necrophilia because it prevents him from having to connect with living humans. Furthermore, it states that it allows him to focus on his own needs rather than having to focus on the needs of someone else. Shortly after this reveal, one quiet evening while he's at his post, he receives a distress call from the maternity ward that explains his services are needed to defuse a hostile situation. Once there, he encounters an irate man who's being restrained by the hospital staff because his wife suffered a miscarriage. Meanwhile, as the narrator stands aside to watch everything go down, the irate man breaks free, and before anyone can react, he murders his wife, then kills himself. Which, it's during this gruesome act that the narrator notices Dr. Helen nearby, who seems completely unfazed by the tragedy. And while he's looking at her, he notices that she's admiring the dead fetus before them, and he realizes that there's something cold within her eyes. From that moment forward, he becomes fascinated with Dr. Helen, where he watches her from his computer monitors. Then, as he observes her actions, eventually he watches her sneak off to the morgue. And since he knows that she has no business going there, he decides to investigate. Which, upon him doing so, he encounters her sitting cross legged on the morgue floor, eating the stillborn from the previous night. Now, although under any other circumstance this would end her career, this moment actually sparks an unintended relationship between the two. And as their relationship grows, they start to indulge in their most depraved and hedonistic desires, which, of course, go from bad to worst. Originally published in 2015, Dead Inside was Chandler Morrison's first book. Yet, following its release, he was dropped by his publisher after he staged a performance art piece at Bizarro Fest, where he reenacted a sex scene from its novella. In particular, this act included a baby doll that was intended to portray an aborted fetus. Amazon.com states that the current edition of Dead Inside was published in 2020 by Death's Head Press, and it holds a 4-star rating with over 3,400 reviews. In an interview conducted by Stephen J. Golds with Punk Noir Press, Morrison explained that Dead Inside is a quirky satire about social outcasts and how their relationship is affected by conformity and the expectations of society. He elaborated that as he wrote Dead Inside, he had been watching a lot of French extreme movies that contrasted artistic beauty with excessive violence, and he was interested in doing something similar to that style of entertainment. He added that he believes that there's something inherently silly about extreme violence that's used for effect. With that in mind, Morrison admitted it's sort of baffling to him at how riled up people get over Dead Inside because the entire book is kind of ridiculous by design. And he explained you could overlay most of the scenes in it with a laugh track, and that's basically the point. Fun facts! Here's a few things you might not know about Chandler Morrison. Chandler Morrison is currently the author of 8 books that specialize in satire, philosophy, transgressive fiction, and extreme horror. Overall, his writing typically explores taboo topics and tends to be harshly critical of American society and culture. Some of his influences include Bret Easton Ellis, Chuck Palahniuk, Edgar Allan Poe, and Donald Ray Pollock. Other than Dead Inside, his achievements include American Narcissus, Along the Path of Torment, Just to See Hell, Hate to Feel, Until the Sun, Human Shaped Fiends, and Thigh Gap. Among those, Human Shaped Fiends is a part of the Splatter Western series, which is composed of over 20 books and feature authors like Christopher Triana, Haley Piper, Christine Morgan, Brian Smith, and many more. His book Thigh Gap is included with the series known as My Dark Library, which is presented by Nightworm's co owner Sadie Hartman. Currently, there are 6 books in this series, which feature L.P. Hernandez, Kelsey Yu, Tim McGregor, P.L. Watts, and R.A. Busby. Now that we have that out of the way, it's time to move on to the spoiler section, which, if you have a weak stomach or if you haven't read this before, you're going to want to skip this segment. And if you would like to do so, all you have to do is scroll down to the comments section where you'll see that I have a pinned comment at the top with the timestamp in it. Once you click that timestamp, it will direct you away from the spoilers section and bring you to the thoughts chapter. Now, you only have 17 seconds to do this. So, ready, set, go! Since everyone's had the opportunity to click away, I would like to talk about a few moments that were really disturbing. First up is the scene when the narrator meets Tamra. Now, leading up to this, the narrator explained he's able to smell out people who are near death because they release a peculiar odor. Following that, one evening as he's making his rounds, he follows his nose to one of the hospital rooms where a young woman named Tamara is on her deathbed because she was severely tortured and sexually assaulted by a gang. Then, after he enters her room and they acknowledge one another, he says that he's sorry she was raped. But to his surprise, she explains that she enjoyed it because she believes sex is about control and her attackers made her feel completely powerless. Then, once she identifies that there's something missing within him, he confirms that he has no life inside. Furthermore, he explains to her that when she dies, he's going to have sex with her corpse. To which she responds, "Good, I'm sure I'll enjoy it." From here, she explains that when she was a child, her uncle used to get her drunk and sexually abuse her. But as the years passed and she grew older, she started to enjoy the abuse and everything became consensual. Then, after dropping that bomb, she explains that she's going to die a happy death because she was tortured and raped. Also, she tells the narrator that she looks forward to him having sex with her corpse. Once this is established, the next time the narrator meets Tamara is in the morgue, where he violates her body in ways that are too graphic for me to describe on this platform. Y'all, this whole scenario was difficult to get through because the sad thing is, some people who have been groomed into abuse have the potential to go down a path that's similar to what we see with Tamara. Specifically, one where things that are considered to be harmful or unhealthy become normalized. Also, since I doubt she ever received the therapeutic help she needed, it's pretty obvious that she didn't know how to cope with what she had been through, and she didn't know how to sort out her emotions. Instead, she ended up just seeking out a higher form of masochism and submission, which eventually killed her. And even though her characteristics don't sum up every abuse survivor, it is important to realize that people of her mindset do exist. And if they don't receive the help that they need, their mindset can worsen. Aside from that, this was the moment that made me feel like the narrator was equivalent to a vulture. And once I made that comparison, I couldn't see him as anything else. Which I think the main reason why I felt this way was due to him being able to smell out a dying person no differently than how a vulture uses its heightened sense of smell. Also, it was during this time when I felt like the narrator and Helen were essentially the same predator. And the only thing that made them different was the fact that the narrator violated the bodies of those who had already lived, whereas Helen violated the bodies of those who had yet to live. Which, in my opinion, their roles made a really interesting statement, specifically one that suggested that we're preyed upon from birth to burial. The next disturbing moment that stood out to me was when Helen and the narrator went on a date. to an abortion clinic. So, leading up to this, Helen had been pretty adamant about pursuing a relationship with the narrator. And even though she understood that he has no interest whatsoever in connecting with another human being, she reasoned since they knew one another's darkest secrets, it would allow them to be themselves around each other without there being any judgment. Nonetheless, although at first the narrator stood firm on not giving in, Helen remained persistent until he caved and took her out on a date. And even though everything went as well as it possibly could, by the end of the night, Helen made him feel uncomfortable, which resulted in him running away. Well, come the following night, she apologizes for putting him in an awkward circumstance. And to make everything up, she's decided to let him watch her eat. So, because of his curiosity being piqued, he takes her up on her offer, and a few nights later, they break into an abortion clinic where they eventually make it to the hazardous waste area. From here, Helen strips naked and begins eating an abortion while pleasuring herself. And although the narrator has no interest in having sex with a living woman, he loses control and mounts her while she continues to eat and rub herself down with gore. However, that's not the worst of everything, because after they take a break, Helen gets him aroused once again, but this time she mounts his penis with a dead baby. Y'all, this was the first time in my existence that I had been shocked so hard that I felt my entire body go ice cold. Because not only is the thought of this disgusting, but the author described in fine detail everything that went down. Like nothing was left to the reader's imagination at all. And when I say he described everything in fine detail, I'm talking about how the fetus appeared, how its genitals were, and how the penetration felt. So, yeah, it was very vividly painted for the reader. And instead of this just taking up about a paragraph, this act actually goes on for what would be about the amount of a page. And the author does not let up until the fetus is nothing more than a headless mush. Needless to say, after Nisa and I read this, we were in complete disbelief. As a matter of fact, I was so stunned, I could not focus on any other theme or subject after having read this moment. And in order for me to be able to think straight again, I had to finish my read, put the book down, take a break, then start over after the shock value had died. And upon doing so, I realized that this was the moment where their sexual act had changed everything. And last is the grand finale, which, leading up to this, the narrator and Helen underwent a personality change where they started to act outside of their characters. For example, throughout the whole book, Helen hated the person she was, and she was afraid of getting caught. But after having sex with the narrator, she adapted his philosophies regarding self acceptance, and she started to not care what other people thought. As far as the narrator is concerned, after they had sex, he started to unwillingly crawl out of his shell, and he unintentionally shared his philosophies with a paramedic and a janitor. After that, Helen revealed that she was pregnant with the narrator's baby, and considering the fact that he never liked children to start with, he demanded that she have an abortion. Then, after she refused to bow to his demand, he ended up going through insomnia, which it was during this time that he spiraled out to the point where he was sharing his philosophies, he gave relationship advice, and he actually saved the life of a wreck victim. Meanwhile, as his life is turned upside down, Helen falls off of the face of the planet for about a good week, week and a half. Then, one night, out of the blue, she gives him a call and explains that the baby is dead inside and she wants him to come over. So after he gets off the phone with her, he goes and buys her flowers, then goes to her house. Once inside, he tries to talk her out of doing the inevitable. Nonetheless, his advice falls on deaf ears, and she gives herself a C section where she then pulls out her dead baby and begins to eat it while she masturbates. But wait, there's more, because after Helen dies, not only does he have sex with her corpse, he pulls out her eyeball and has sex with her skull. Then he rubs himself down with her viscera, and after he has an orgasm, he wonders if he has now reached the peak of his existence. For those of you who are still around, shortly thereafter, the narrator goes and gets a shower, and after he's finished, he returns downstairs. However, at that exact moment, a car pulls into the driveway, and all of the puzzle pieces suddenly fall into place as he realizes Helen has been married this whole time, and now her husband is about to walk in and catch him. Now, although the narrator felt like this was his ultimate orgasm and it was the peak of his existence, I still feel like the dead fetus sex scene was the Everest moment of this book. Nonetheless, the ending was still pretty disgusting. But I did like the twist where Helen's husband walked in on him, and I feel like it states that no matter how comfortable you might be while committing a crime, eventually you will get caught. I'd like to take this opportunity to bitch. Now, there ain't no way in hell I can narrow this down to one person, because at the end of the day, the narrator and Helen were two equally disgusting pieces of gutter trash. Like, on one hand, we have a walking, talking septic tank, and then on the other hand, we have a living, breathing, trashed porta potty that's been sitting out under the Mississippi heat. And even though they have their differences, they are essentially the same thing. First off, as far as the narrator is concerned, the only props I could give him was he did not want to have children and he urged for Helen to have an abortion. Which, let's face it, we do not need some crotch goblins running around that's born in their image. Also, while I would like to say that the narrator was a sociopath in every sense of the word, I honestly can't say that because he did save a woman's life when he had the opportunity to let her die. Nonetheless, this doesn't change the fact that old Needle Dick the corpse banger date raped a girl in high school and destroyed her life. Aside from all of that, not only does he have sex with dead people, but he screws the corpses of the elderly and children. And you know what? If I was dead and I was looking down from heaven on my body and I saw a pervert like him taking advantage of my corpse, to be honest, I'd probably be like, yeah, I still got it. Now, let's move on to Helen. Yes, girl, you have a problem because let me tell you, dead babies do not need to be looked at like they're steak tartare. And to be perfectly honest, at first I did feel sorry for her because she really struggled with her urges. However, that sorrow definitely went to hell in a handbasket when she decided to use an aborted fetus like a fleshlight on her boo thing. Also, she allowed a patient to die when she had ample opportunity to help them live. Not to mention that her goal is to have a baby and turn it into the same sick, twisted pervert as herself, which, I mean, this totally comments on how some asshole adults have a goal to birth a carbon copy of themselves. And you know what? I am absolutely thrilled that the book ended the way it did. I'm glad that Helen died. I'm happy she wasn't able to birth another little Jeffrey Dahmer or Marjorie Taylor Greene. And I'm glad that her husband caught the narrator. All I hope is he was pissed enough to kill the dirty bastard and not allow him to see a single day in prison. Dead Inside by Chandler Morrison is perhaps the most grotesque boy meets girl scenario I've ever encountered. And while I feel like this book reaches a whole new level of depravity, it did provide interesting characters, deep philosophies, and a wide range of themes that include unwanted desires, stereotypes, dark secrets, second chances, addiction, poverty, and hedonism. Plus, as a fun side item, it had quite a few cool nods to goth and punk pop culture, as well as transgressive fiction authors. Character-wise, Nisa and I agreed that neither one of us cared for the narrator or Helen at all. But at the same time, I feel like their development was deliberate as we were never supposed to like them in the first place. Also, even though neither of these characters were pure evil and they were a far cry from being virtuous, somehow the author was able to show that they weren't literal monsters and they were, in fact, flesh and blood human beings. Even still, at first, I couldn't help comparing the narrator and Helen to vampires, which this was mostly because they were nocturnal and they had unnatural appetites. And as I thought about that, I considered how serial killers and criminals had been compared to supernatural beings before we advanced as a society. Also, even though I made that connection, for the most part, I felt like the narrator and Helen were the personification of vultures as they preyed on the dead and dying. Now, even though this is an extreme book, it is also transgressive fiction. And in that regards, I feel like the narrator and Helen are traditional. For example, early on, it had been established that the narrator had been a nonconformist ever since he was a child. And because of him working so hard to be an outcast, anytime normalcy was brought into his life, he became enraged. Which, this is one of the reasons why I was so interested when he unintentionally began to act outside of his character. But as far as Helen is concerned, she wanted desperately to fit in and be normal. However, as the book progressed, her mentality became more depraved and she started to see herself as an elevated figure over basic human beings. Also, after reading this a second time, I considered the significance of the main characters. And after mulling it over, I believe that their roles made a strong statement in regards to how bleak life can be. Which I say this because we have Helen, who eats the remains of those who could have potentially had life, whereas the narrator molests the remains of those who had already lived. And with that in mind, I tend to think that this is making a statement about how we're preyed upon from birth to burial. Before I move on, I found it really interesting that even though the narrator had no interest in connecting with anybody, the story was told from his perspective. Like, he was so antisocial, he never even mentioned his name. But at the same time, he's literally telling the reader his every thought and secret. And because of how that's constructed, I wonder if this was the author suggesting to us that no matter how antisocial we might be, somewhere within our subconscious, we want to connect to another person. With character development aside, I'd like to tackle some of the philosophical aspects of this work. At one point, Helen and the narrator reason that they aren't actually doing anything bad when they indulge in their cravings because their targets don't have any family and they're already dead. Which this way of thinking poses a morality question, which asks, should Helen and the narrator be able to do whatever they want to human remains considering they aren't physically hurting anyone who is alive? Despite what answer you choose, I feel like their characteristics lead to other philosophical questions, such as at what point does a person's actions become so vile that they're no longer seen as a human being, but a monster? Furthermore, at what length must an individual go before they're removed entirely from society or the social norm? Another philosophical question that comes into play is why does the death of a stranger matter to us? Which this question is pondered on when the narrator encounters a patient who's been admitted into the hospital due to a drug overdose. And even though an answer is never given one way or the other, the funny story is the narrator finds himself in a circumstance where he has the opportunity to save a stranger's life. And instead of just not letting this become a part of his problem, he decides to call for help. Another philosophical question that this book poses is what determines if a person died a happy death or a tragic death. Now, personally, when I think about a happy death, I think about my aunt because when she passed away, she was surrounded by all of the things that brought her joy. However, the narrator takes that concept to the extreme and he reasons that a drug addict can die a happy death from an overdose because that individual died doing what they enjoyed. Prior to that, there's a circumstance where a young woman who was groomed into abuse had been sexually assaulted and tortured to the point of death. Yet before she died, she explained to the narrator that she was completely fulfilled because she enjoyed her torment. And because of that, she would die a happy death. So, with this context, would the death of the drug addict and the abuse victim be considered happy or tragic? Personally, I think tragic, but I'm sure that's up for debate. Theme wise, before I move on to the heavy stuff, this book does actually have some dark humor to it. Like, aside from the narrator's snarky tone and his comments and everything, there's a scene where the author takes a jab at stereotypes. And in particular, this is when. Sorry, I can't do this without laughing. Anyway, this is when the narrator admits that he would like to open up a funeral parlor, and Helen admits she wants to open up an abortion clinic. Okay, so I got that over with. Anyway, as laughable as that might sound, it did remind me of some urban legends and propaganda that I had heard as I had grown up, where, for example, morticians sleep with their clients and abortion doctors eat dead babies. And as far fetched as that sounds, I'm sure many places have those little legends and stuff, but I honestly couldn't stop laughing when that was presented in the book, and obviously it's something that still makes me giggle. Yeah, I know, I'm going to hell. With humor aside, I noticed the subject of unwanted desires was significant with this work, especially when it came down to Helen's character and how she wanted nothing more than to stop craving human flesh and to fit in with society. Yet, even though her morals changed as the book progressed and she ended up embracing her taboos, I feel like had she received the psychiatric help that she needed, then this could have prevented her from spiraling out. Other than Helen, the narrator was unapologetically hedonistic when it came down to satisfying his desires. However, after one particular scene, he ended up going through a change, which this change might be minor to us, but it was major to him. And even though he didn't want this change to occur, it happened anyway. Tagging on to that is the idea of personal dark secrets and how an individual might live in constant fear in regards to the idea of those secrets being found out. Which there's definitely two different kinds of people when it boils down to this. Such as, on one hand, we have the narrator who is very smug and doesn't even really consider what would happen if his secrets were made public. As a matter of fact, I think he's so arrogant, he doesn't even believe he'd get caught in the first place. On the other hand, there's Helen, which at the beginning she explains that she's absolutely mortified over the idea of people finding out her secret. As a matter of fact, she goes into detail about the stress that she's under every day in regards to this. But with this in mind, I do think one of the points that the book makes is no matter how well you think you might hide your crimes, eventually you will get caught. It will come back to bite you in the butt. Another hard hitting subject that this book touches on is addiction. And this is primarily seen with Helen's character and how she has an opioid reliance, which unfortunately, opioid addiction is really bad here in America, especially in the medical field. But aside from her, there's a lot of secondary characters in this book that also suffer from addiction, and this subject is seen in quite a few different ways. But no matter how it's portrayed, each of these characters eventually go down the path of no return, where their vices eventually kill them. Next up is the subject of second chances, which this is commented on when the narrator observes a priest absolving a patient of his sins while he's on his deathbed. And while this is happening, the narrator considers if the doctor came in and explained that there was a misdiagnosis and he was going to live, the patient would return to his way of living and his being absolved would mean nothing. Now, I hate to sound pessimistic, but I think this makes a strong comment on human nature in general because people rarely change who they are. Also, even though this subject wasn't as blatant as everything else, I noticed where poverty was commented on, which this was primarily seen by how the narrator and Helen were able to do whatever they wanted to human remains without getting caught. And I think the main reason why is because throughout the book, they mention how these patients don't have families. And yeah, it's obvious. These are patients in a charity hospital, and they don't have all of the same sources or benefits as everyone else that might be in a regular hospital. So, yeah, that does reduce the amount of people who would check in on their loved ones, which in turn would give these predators the ability to do just about whatever they wanted. Before I move away from the themes, another subject that I noticed throughout this book was hedonism, which I feel like I've given some pretty good examples of this already by talking about the characters. But to be perfectly honest, I think all of us are hedonists to some degree. Like, personally, I'm a pleasure seeker when it comes down to good food, good entertainment, and good conversations. So, in that regards, being a hedonist isn't always a bad thing. However, if you practice hedonism to the degree that we see in this book, then you probably need to reel it back a little bit. Aside from all of that, this book has quite a few nods to goth and punk pop culture as well as transgressive fiction. For example, as far as goth pop culture is concerned, there's a character in this book named Nick, who not only is the narrator's landlord, but he's the owner of a bar called The Bad Seed. And for those of you who are unaware, this is a direct reference to the music group Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Plus, the author goes one step further by referencing the song Where the Wild Roses Grow, which was sung by Nick Cave and Kylie Minogue, which, if you have not heard this song before, I highly recommend that you check it out. Other than the Nick Cave references, there's a quirky nod to the song called Cannibal Song by Ministry when Helen notes that track 4 on the album, The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, is her favorite song. Which this made me giggle because it makes sense with Helen's backstory that this would be a favorite of hers. Also, this book did introduce me to a music group I had never heard of before called the Gutter Twins. And after I checked them out on Spotify, I can wholeheartedly say that I am a fan, and if you haven't listened to their music before, you should definitely check them out. From a literary standpoint, the narrator and Helen speak of names like Edgar Allan Poe, Chuck Palahniuk, Will Self, and Bukowski. And among those names, of course, I'm familiar with Poe and Palahniuk, but I've never read Self or Bukowski. However, I have a pretty good feeling that these authors would do perfect on the same shelf. Overall, Dead Inside didn't scare me or creep me out, but it should go without saying that yes, this book grossed me out. This was the most vile, disgusting book I've ever read in my existence. As far as being on a level of depravity, I think this is the most disturbing thing I've ever encountered. And this is coming from a person who's seen the Human Centipede movies and a Serbian film, as well as the August Underground movies and the Guinea Pig movies. This, it was a whole new level. Dead Inside by Chandler Morrison is the kind of book where if you want to read it as a surface read, you can totally do that. But if you look past its depravity, it actually has a lot to say. As a matter of fact, when I picked this up, I had no clue it was going to be so deep with its philosophies. But at the end of the day, if you're looking for a repulsive book that makes a strong message, then this book here will make everything else within the subgenre look like it's written by Nicholas Sparks. So if you think you can handle it, grab your puke bag and buy a copy of this because I do highly recommend. Now that we're at the end of this episode, I would like to thank these amazing people for contributing to my Patreon account. As you can tell, some of the names listed here are creators, so be sure to check out their work. And if you would like to contribute to my Patreon account, I have a link available in the description section of this episode, where for $5 a month, I'll give you a shout out at the end of my videos. And if there is a certain profession you would like for me to tie to your name, just let me know and I'll do that. Also, I do have a $10 tier available where for $10 a month, I'll still give you the shout out as you see here, but I do creepy photography on the side, so at the beginning of every month, I send out one of my creepy photos. From there, you can print it off and do whatever you like with it. So if you're able to do this, that's awesome. If not, no sweat. I just hope you return to this channel so we can continue to have a good time together. Also, if you would like to hit me up on social media, links to my Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are all available in the description section of this episode. Also, if you've not subscribed to this channel, be sure to subscribe and click that notifications bell because I have more book reviews coming in the near future. So until we see each other again, I hope you have a great week and sweet nightmares.